He walked into his own studio, convinced he was the one in control, until Melania Trump flipped his own tactics back on him, leaving him utterly speechless on live TV. The cameras rolled, capturing every moment as the polished set of the Spotlight Hour shimmered under the intense glare of studio lights. This show had earned its reputation for its no-holds-barred approach, where tough questions weren't just expected. They were the main event. The audience, a mix of devoted fans and skeptical critics, sat on the edge of their seats, eagerly anticipating the night's big showdown. At the very center of it all sat Melania Trump. Dressed in a refined yet understated silk blouse paired with impeccably tailored trousers, she exuded the same composed presence she had maintained throughout her years in the White House. Her posture, flawless. Her expression, neutral, unreadable, revealing nothing. She was a woman who had been endlessly analyzed, criticized, admired, and underestimated. And yet, no one seemed to truly grasp who she was. Across from her, the host subtly adjusted his earpiece, flashed a smirk full of confidence, and leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He was a media powerhouse, someone who had built his name on exposing public figures, drawing them into sound bites that would go viral in an instant. He had locked horns with politicians, celebrities, and CEOs, always teetering on the edge between hard-hitting journalism and pure provocation. And tonight, he was ready to stir the pot. The first few minutes of the interview followed the usual script, almost predictable. Questions about her life after the White House, her initiatives, her time as First Lady. Melania responded in the same composed, deliberate tone she had always used, providing just enough to answer, yet never quite enough to be taken apart and analyzed. But then, something changed. The energy in the room shifted. The host's smile, just a little too tight. His laughter, a little too forced. And the audience, they could feel it. He was waiting for the perfect moment to seize control, to steer the narrative, to turn Melania Trump into just another guest who had wandered into his arena, unprepared. But as the conversation unfolded, something wasn't going according to his plan. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't rattled. In fact, she wasn't giving him much of anything to work with at all. That's when his strategy shifted. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the glossy desk between them, his expression sharpening. The charm, it faded just slightly, making room for something far more familiar, condescension. Melania noticed it instantly. She had seen this before. Different faces, different settings, but the same strategy. They always approached her with a polished arrogance, convinced they had her all figured out. They framed her as a passive bystander in her own story, as if she had merely stood beside power rather than held her own within it. But she had played this game before. The host smirked, confident, thinking she didn't see what was coming. But she did. He tapped his fingers against the desk, his smirk widening just slightly. This was a move he had perfected over the years, slowly tightening the net, luring his guests into a false sense of security before delivering the line that would ignite social media. Adjusting his suit jacket, he took a breath, and then he struck. "So, Melania," he began, stretching out her name with deliberate ease, "now that you've had some time away from Washington, what's life like? I imagine it must be nice to finally relax." On the surface, a simple question, but the way he said it, as if her years in the White House had been nothing more than lounging around, left a bitter undertone hanging in the air. Melania didn't blink. She gave a slight nod, carefully choosing her words. "I focus on my work, my initiatives, my family." Her accent, smooth, deliberate, ensured every syllable landed exactly as she intended. The host gave a slow, calculated nod, pretending to consider her answer. Right. Be best, wasn't it?" He chuckled, just softly enough for the audience to catch. That was your anti-bullying campaign. The phrasing, not outright disrespectful, but the undertone, crystal clear. That little thing. Melania's expression remained unreadable. The host shifted in his seat, pressing forward. "I have to ask, though," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Do you think it really made an impact? I mean, let's be honest. There were a lot of people who didn't quite get it." A few muffled chuckles rippled through the audience. This was his specialty, disguising sharp-edged statements as harmless observations. He wasn't insulting her outright, but he was daring her to take offense. Melania exhaled softly. She had dealt with this before. Still, he wasn't done. Sensing an opportunity, he leaned in further. "Some people felt it was ironic, given, well, certain figures in your circle," he said with a sly smile. The audience knew exactly what he meant. A louder chuckle. A few scattered claps. The moment stretched. Most guests by now would have shifted uncomfortably, glanced toward the camera, laughed awkwardly, or given some vague, diplomatic response. But Melania did none of that. Instead, she remained perfectly still, watching him with a calm so unnerving it made people uncomfortable. For just a fraction of a second, the host hesitated. She had seen this tactic before. Laugh it off, let the audience take the cue to mock, soften up the subject, and then deliver the real hit. And then it came. The host tilted his head slightly, eyes gleaming. "I mean, let's be real, Melania," he said, his voice dripping with mock casualness. "You were First Lady. But you weren't exactly out there, were you?" The audience chuckled, louder this time. The words were dressed up as a joke. But they weren't. They were calculated, carefully chosen to make her seem ornamental, to diminish her. Melania's fingers twitched slightly against her lap. Not from discomfort, from calculation, because she knew exactly what she was about to do. And the host? He had no idea what was coming. The audience was still chuckling when the host decided to go for the kill. "You know," he said, tapping his pen against the desk, "I think a lot of people just didn't quite see you. You weren't as, how do I put this, present as some of the other First Ladies." The implication, it hung thick in the air. Melania didn't move. Her breathing, steady. Her expression, unreadable. But behind those piercing blue eyes, something shifted. The host mistook her silence for hesitation, as if she was unsure how to respond. He misread her stillness as weakness, a mistake many had made before. So he smiled, pressing forward. "It's just that when people think of First Ladies, they think of Eleanor Roosevelt, Michelle Obama, even Hillary Clinton." His voice, light, conversational, but sharp, like a blade. Women who were visible, you know, active, engaged. The audience stirred. Some nodded. A few murmured. Some smirked, enjoying the tension. The host leaned back, crossing his arms. "I mean, tell me, do you ever feel like maybe you could have done more?" There it was. The line that turned the room into a pressure cooker. Perfectly worded, wrapped in faux curiosity, laced with just enough plausible deniability to seem like an innocent question. But it wasn't innocent. It was an insult. A dismissal, a framing of her as an accessory rather than a force in her own right. The camera panned to Melania. The audience had seen her composed silence before. But this moment, it was different. Now, there was something calculated in her stillness. For the first time, the host hesitated. Something was coming, and it would change everything. The air in the studio shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. The kind of silence that settles in just before a storm. Still poised, Melania Trump finally moved. She tilted her head, just slightly, enough to let the host know she had heard him. Not just his words, but the intent buried beneath them. And then, with a level of measured control that only comes from years of relentless scrutiny, she spoke. "Let me ask you something," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "You say people didn't see me. But tell me, what is it that you think you saw?" The host blinked, just once. Melania didn't wait for him to answer. "I was First Lady of the United States. I represented this country on the world stage. I visited hospitals, schools, communities in crisis. I met with leaders, with families who had lost everything. And yet, because I did not perform for the cameras the way you expected, you say I was not present." Her tone never wavered. It didn't need to. The audience? No longer laughing. The host parted his lips, as if about to interject. But Melania continued. Her voice steady, deliberate. "I understand why you ask this question. It is easier to reduce people to images, to turn a person into a headline, a sound bite." She let the words hang in the air before delivering the final cut. "That is your business, no?" She wasn't harsh, but she was precise. She was peeling him apart in real time. The host shifted in his chair. The easy confidence he had worn so effortlessly at the start of the interview, cracking, just slightly. Melania leaned forward now, resting her forearms on the chair. The movement, subtle, but it marked a shift in control. "You think I should have done more?" she asked, locking eyes with him. "But tell me, how much is enough for you?" The host swallowed. Melania let the question linger. "In America," she continued, her voice soft, yet unwavering, "we say we believe in strength, in privacy, in dignity. But the moment a woman doesn't perform the way you expect, when she doesn't shout to prove herself, you say she was never there." The camera caught the host's face. He wasn't smiling anymore. Melania leaned back, smoothing an invisible crease from her blouse. "I have been many things," she said, "but invisible? Never. That's why we're sitting here today, no?" A beat. Then applause. It started slow, hesitant. But then it grew. Some clapped. Others cheered. It wasn't even clear if they knew why they were doing it. Maybe it was the sheer audacity of what they had just witnessed. Maybe it was because they had felt the shift happen, in real time. The host exhaled, forcing a chuckle, grasping for control. But that moment, it was gone. The interview had changed. Melania Trump had just flipped the script, and there was no going back. The tension in the room, undeniable. The host, who had spent years controlling the narrative, suddenly found himself at a loss. Shifting in his seat, he forced a smile, but it lacked the usual confidence. His eyes darted toward the audience, searching for an ally. But the reaction, not what he expected. The applause hadn't stopped. A few in the front row leaned in, eyes locked on Melania, waiting. Others whispered to each other, no longer amused by the host's usual tricks. The energy, it had shifted. The audience, they weren't with him anymore. And he knew it. Still, he tried to recover, letting out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Well," he started, grasping for control, "I wasn't saying you were invisible, Melania. Just that, well, maybe people expected a little more, you know? But it was weak. And Melania knew it. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Not one of amusement, but of understanding. She had played this game before. The host cleared his throat, trying again. I mean, people just... Melania raised a hand. Not a word. Yet it silenced him instantly. "I know what you mean," she said. "You think I should have shouted more? Demanded more attention?" She let the words hang for just a second, then continued. "But I do not shout to be seen, and I do not need your approval to know my worth." The audience erupted. This time, it wasn't polite applause. It was a statement. The host's jaw tightened. He forced a laugh, but it was hollow. He had lost control, and now he had to sit in the very spotlight he had set up for her. This interview, it wasn't going as planned. The cameras were rolling, but the energy in the room had completely flipped. What was supposed to be an easy moment, another clip for his highlight reel, another viral takedown of a public figure? Instead, he was the one being picked apart, exposed. His eyes flicked to his notes, searching for a way out, something to pivot to. But what do you do when the guest has already taken over the room? The studio lights suddenly felt hotter. The audience, they weren't laughing anymore. And social media, oh, they were about to have a field day. By the time the interview ended, the damage already done. The cameras cut, the stage crew moved in, and the host, he gave his usual polite handshake. But everyone in that studio knew what had just happened. This wasn't just another talk show moment. This was something else. Minutes later, the first clips hit social media. Melania Trump just flipped the script on this host. And I'm here for it. She didn't raise her voice. Not once. And he fell apart. Say what you want about her. But this was the most composed destruction I've ever seen. And it didn't take long before mainstream news picked it up. Headlines flooded the internet. Melania Trump stuns TV host with unexpected response. "I do not need your approval." Melania fires back live on air. Watch. TV host left speechless after Melania Trump's icy response. The clip replayed on every major news station. Pundits analyzed her tone, her word choices, the sheer confidence in her delivery. Some defended her. "She's been underestimated for years," one commentator said. "This moment, proof she was always in control." Others downplayed it. "Let's not act like this was some great takedown," a critic scoffed. "She just dodged the question, like any other politician." But it didn't matter what side people were on, because everyone was talking about it. By the next morning, Melania's response had been viewed millions of times across platforms. Twitter threads broke down every second of the exchange. Body language experts weighed in, analyzing how the host's demeanor shifted the moment he realized he was losing ground. Memes flooded the internet. One of the most viral, a side-by-side clip. 1 second, the host, smugly leading the conversation. The next, his face slowly falling, realizing he had lost control. The caption, "When you think you're setting the trap, but you're actually in it." And the host, silent. No tweets, no statements, no attempts to spin the moment. Because what could he say? He had walked into his own studio thinking this was just another night, another guest, another chance to play the game. Instead, he became the story. By the end of the week, the dust, it hadn't settled. If anything, the debate had only grown louder. Some called it a lesson in composure, a masterclass in how to handle condescension without losing control. Others saw it as a reckoning, a shift in how Melania Trump was perceived. For years, she had been dismissed, reduced to a public figure standing in someone else's shadow. But now, not anymore. Political analysts debated the long-term impact. Would this moment redefine her legacy? Did it expose the media's double standards? Some of the same voices who had mocked her for years were suddenly forced to acknowledge something they had refused to before. She was never as fragile as they had made her out to be. But beyond the headlines and the Twitter debates, something deeper was at play. This moment resonated because it wasn't just about Melania Trump. It was about every person who had ever been talked over, dismissed, underestimated. Every woman who had ever been told she needed to be louder, more aggressive, more visible, just to be taken seriously. But Melania, she didn't yell. She didn't argue. She didn't scramble to defend herself. She owned the moment, without ever raising her voice. And that's what people remembered. The host. He'd move on. Next week, he'd interview someone else. He'd pretend like it never happened. But no matter how many guests sat across from him in that chair, no one would forget the night he lost control of his own show. In a world that demands you prove yourself by being louder, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay composed and let your presence speak for itself. Let this be a reminder. Strength isn't about volume. It's about control. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Hit that like button, drop a comment below, and let's keep the conversation going, because some moments deserve to be remembered.